Chapter 10. Climb Mount Narodnaya. In my first book, The Stormbreakers, I complained about how history seems to have forgotten the finer details of the stories surrounding Jericho and her companions. This forgetfulness extends multiple generations back in time, and the greatest victim of this collective memory lapse is, in my opinion, one of the most important people in my generation. Kotori Sato has been reduced to a footnote in history, a trivia question, something for students to regurgitate on some exam and then quickly forget about. The mother of humanity's savior has been so effectively forgotten that when I stopped random people on the street to ask, no single person could tell me what Kotori Sato looked like or what kind of person she was. She was simply Jericho's mother and nothing else. To say I am offended is an understatement. I hope, in the second act of this book, to restore some knowledge of Kotori and the fully fleshed out person she was before becoming a one-dimensional bit of encyclopedia knowledge. Not just because she was a personal friend of mine for a few years in my youth, and not just because her role in founding the Stormbreakers has been forgotten. Out of the 6 men and women who would go on to found the Stormbreakers, Kotori was the first to see action. She was not a soldier at the time. When it happened, she wasn't even old enough to drink or vote or get married. But nonetheless, she was the first member of our team to experience war. Kotori was there, in the snow-covered fields of Hokkaido, when everything broke down. When the Soviets and Japanese were left with no further options. She witnessed the opening moments of my father's war. Now, using a combination of declassified documents and testimonials from people who were there, I can recreate the events of that fateful day. December 9th, 2006. Nishino Sato Junior High School, Sapporo. Like the vast majority of 13-year-olds in the year 2006, Kotori Sato was not paying attention in class. She was doodling in her notebook, crafting with care an image she'd spent the better part of the day working on. Every once in a while, she'd look up to snatch a furtive glance at her 2 best friends. Chihiro Iwasaki was a scrawny kid with long, dark hair. Secluded in a corner seat at the back of the classroom, Chihiro kept her bangs over her eyes so that nobody would notice her checking out cute boys instead of following the teacher's lecture. Kotori's other friend, Asuna Tachibana, was seated directly in front of her. If there were 2 people who could look less like one another, it was these 2. Kotori was, if my sources are accurate, quite the stereotypical girly girl who modeled her appearance after TV stars and fashion icons. Kotori wore plenty of makeup and spent a lot of time and effort to make her hair look pretty. Then there was Asuna. Everything about her screamed tomboy. Asuna kept her messy brown hair cut short, wore athletic clothing, and always seemed to have at least one cut or scrape on her hands. Like her friends, Asuna was also failing to pay any heed to the teacher's mind-numbing tone. She had her flip phone underneath the desk and was surreptitiously sending messages whenever the teacher turned his back. Up at the front of the classroom, Nazuko Sawano continued his history lesson. Mr. Sawano is certainly among one of the luckiest humans to have ever lived. He survived all of the great wars and disasters of the past 50 years and lived long enough to see the war in heaven, which he also survived. While he did pass away about 20 years ago, Mr. Sawano left behind a detailed series of memoirs for us to work from. Most of this account comes from him. He tells us that roughly halfway through his presentation on the history of feudal Japan, he looked at the back of the class and spotted Kotori, Chihiro, and Asuna all slacking off. Mr. Sawano had already disciplined Chihiro and Asuna earlier in the day, and when he looked back, these 2 students saw him, stopped what they were doing, and made some attempt to pretend they were paying attention. Kotori did not. She continued sketching in her book. The teacher decided to make an example of her. He crossed the room in a stealthy way, continuing to read aloud from the textbook while rapidly closing the distance between himself and Kotori, who was seated near the center of the room. Several students snickered and giggled when they realized what was about to happen. Asuna turned her head to one side and whispered, "Tori-chan, look out!" Too late. Mr. Sawano grabbed Kotori's textbook in one hand and raised it high into the air, while the girl let out a frustrated moan. "Welcome back to Earth, Miss Sato," Sawano said. "While you were gone, we were discussing the 1904 war with Russia. Did any of that reach you?" He raised Kotori's notebook higher and showed it to the class. On the page, Kotori had drawn 3 American-style superheroes. Each character bore a striking resemblance to herself, Asuna, and Chihiro. Underneath the image was a caption that read, "Go, Storm Riders, go!" "I suppose not," Sawano grumbled. "Well, Miss Sato, I hope you're not going anywhere over Christmas vacation, because I expect from you a 10,000-word essay delivered to my desk on the first day of class after the new year. That should keep you busy." An hour later, classes let out for lunch. The number of students at this school who lived beyond 2036 can be counted on just one hand, so verifiable first-hand accounts are few and far in between. But I do have an accurate picture of what came next. Grumbling and complaining about Mr. Sawano, Kotori and her friends went off to have lunch on their own. Witnesses said they were gossiping about some boy Chihiro Iwasaki took a liking to. About halfway through the lunch hour, the trio arrived in the art classroom, where several other students were spending their free time. Kotori pinned up her drawing on an easel, and the trio set to work completing it. Asuna gave the 2-dimensional copies of herself and her friends a set of flowing capes to improve their superhero costumes. "Your hair is so long, Iwasaki, you don't need a cape," Asuna teased. "Oh, yeah? Well... Chihiro trailed off as she failed to think of a clever comeback. "Hey, Asuna," Kotori said as she grabbed more colored pencils. "Isn't your dad like a cop or something? Wouldn't he get weirded out if he found out you were a superhero?" "You watch way too much TV," Asuna laughed. "My dad's cool. And speaking of TV, did you see that story about the princess? She got back from America last night." Chihiro swooned. "If I could date a rich American, I'd be so happy." "Why?" Asuna said. "'Cause he'd shower you with gifts, or because he'd get you to move into a house that's not close enough for the Russians to spit on?" All 3 girls fell silent at the reminder of how close their country was to the brink of war. None of them wanted to think about it, but soon they would have no choice. Kotori tried to break the uncomfortable silence by saying, "You won't catch me dead dating an American. I heard that Blake kid doesn't even speak our language. Even after the princess spent like 2 years learning English. What a dolt!" Chihiro, Asuna, and Kotori spent the rest of their lunch break completing their self-indulgent self-portrait and bad-mouthing me. I wouldn't have cared. I was on the other side of the planet at the time, and it's quite true that I wouldn't have understood a word of their conversation anyway. Sometime around 1 in the afternoon, Kotori and her friends started making their way towards their next class. They were just rounding a hall corner when a commotion started to run through the school like an electric charge. Students began flocking towards any window that faced north, while repeating a rumor that a hot air balloon had crashed on school grounds. Curiosity got the better of the trio, and they started to make their way towards a window. "A hot air balloon?" Kotori repeated. "Who flies one in the middle of winter?" "Doesn't make any sense," Asuna added. "There's like 2 feet of snow outside. How'd they even take off?" Now, as far as I can tell, there was only about 6 inches of snow on the ground in Sapporo that day. I got this number not from any Japanese source, but a Russian one. The Soviet Red Army preserved most of their records from this event. Finally, Kotori and her friends crammed themselves into a classroom with a window large enough to give them a good view of the football pitch located just north of the school. There were already some 60 or 70 children in the room, so the trio had to push and elbow their way into a good viewing position. It would have been apparent right away why the rumor was of a hot air balloon. Huge sheets of canvas were billowing in the wind as they came to rest on the frozen ground. Men wearing heavy coats and carrying lots of equipment on their backs gathered around, calling to one another in a language Kotori would not have recognized. Meanwhile, one of the gymnasium doors opened. The school principal and the guidance counselor advanced onto the football pitch at a fast clip. The principal waved his arms and tried to get the attention of the men on the field. One of the men who landed on the grounds of Nishino-Sato Junior High School that day was Alexei Volobyov. During the Battle for Earth, he fought alongside me and is now one of the most celebrated soldiers in the United Nations Army. But on December 9th, 2006, he was quite possibly the first soldier of the Red Army to set foot on the Japanese home islands. He was also the first Soviet soldier to kill someone. Alexei told me that he was frightened of the principal. He was certain that an authority figure like this man would be armed with some kind of weapon. So, when Alexei's commanding officer told him to open fire, he did not hesitate. Kotori and her friends had never heard gunfire before in their lives. Sure, they'd heard the fake noises you may know from movies and television, but any war veteran, myself included, can tell you that no amount of fiction can ever prepare you for the real thing. The sound of it cracked and snapped through the air and made the ears of all who heard it throb. Kotori screamed and covered her eyes as both the principal and guidance counselor collapsed to the ground, unmoving. Chaos reigned in the school. Teachers tried to guide the students toward the far exits, but children fled in whatever direction came to mind. Doors slammed open, windows were smashed, and youngsters fled to the four corners of the compass. Plenty of them, quite without meaning to, ran directly into the arms of the invading Soviet troops. Fortunately, these men did not have the stomach for shooting children that day. Alexei said that came much later in the war. Kotori, Chihiro, and Asuna fled together. They ran out of the school and into the snow, racing towards the main road that connected the school to the rest of the town. High above, they could see dozens, if not hundreds of parachutes descending towards the earth. Each one carried a man armed with a rifle. The girls screamed in panic and started running towards the east, towards downtown Sapporo. But they didn't get very far before a black and white car with flashing red lights pulled up alongside them and rolled its window down. Asuna's father was in the driver's seat of the police car. "Get in!" he yelled. "Now!" Chihiro, Kotori, and Asuna all flung themselves into the police car as quickly as they could before Mr. Tachibana floored it. They careened away from the school at high speed, while behind them, Alexei stood in front of the school entrance with a Soviet political officer and a government-appointed photographer. They posed him for a photograph, and by the next morning, the image of a Soviet soldier brandishing his nation's flag on Japanese soil would galvanize the entire world into action. 2007. The first year of the war was an unmitigated disaster for Japan and her allies. Soviet paratroopers locked down most of Hokkaido before the winter snow melted. The only real fight happened in Sapporo, where the Japanese military finally recovered from the shock of the attack and put up a struggle. The Japan Self-Defense Force held the advantage of fighting in their own territory, but that didn't ease the fact that the Soviets had the defenders vastly outnumbered. In downtown Sapporo, the JSDF waged a fighting retreat, buying time for as many civilians to evacuate as possible. Hundreds of planes rose from the airport and fled south, while cruise liners in the harbor were packed to beyond capacity before escaping under cover of darkness. General Artyom Sidorov took command of the Soviet invasion force. He spent most of the year consolidating his forces in Hokkaido and establishing effective command and control over the island. This was a difficult task because Japanese forces, both JSDF and local resistance groups, were constantly putting pressure on the invaders. Counterattacks, sabotage, and probing strikes were a constant part of life on Hokkaido, and the war quickly spilled out from there. The waters around northern Japan became a free-fire zone. Soviet and Japanese Navy ships fired on anything and everything that could be perceived as an attempt to resupply or reinforce their enemies. Korean warships joined the fray as well, but their attempt to blockade Vladivostok was thwarted by the Chinese Navy. Meanwhile, the rest of the world was quickly choosing a side. American troops, planes, ships, and weapons were arriving in Japan daily. The European Union blockaded Western Russia, and the oil-rich nations of the Middle East refused point-blank to continue selling oil to the Soviets. The Chinese were ostracized at the UN for their defense of the Soviet invasion, and were forced to back down and take a more neutral stance when Vietnam, Taiwan, and Myanmar started calling up their military reserves and doing reconnaissance flights over their Chinese borders. America's response was muted, but there was a forceful presence to her silence, like a bear who's just woken up and is still gathering its strength. Roughly a month before the invasion, the Senate trial of Vice President McDonald ended in his own conviction. He was removed from office on the same day. About a week later, the midterm elections happened. The Democratic Party dominated, sweeping the Republicans out of power and forcing my dad to nominate a member of their own party to the now vacant post of vice president. By the time America had her political affairs in order, we were late to the fight. U.S. troops started landing in Japan and taking the fight to the Russians sometime in April of 2007. And in the middle of this all, Princess Asami and her family lived in fear. The imperial family remained in Tokyo, but the danger seemed to be very real. Prince Akio started volunteering for military training. Soldiers and anti-aircraft weapons took up permanent residence on the palace grounds. She and her siblings raised the idea of fleeing to the United States, but the opportunity had passed. The risk of a plane carrying the royals being shot down was too great, as was the risk of a ship being sunk. Princess Asami was trapped in her own country. 2008. The next year, following a lull in the wintertime, brought renewed violence as both sides attempted to seize the initiative. American units arrived in force, and they were under the command of three of the most famous military leaders of the time: Alexis Alexander, Laura Harper, and Peter Van Dorn. During his time as an employee of the government, Ryo Nakagawa was still a reservist in the Japan Self-Defense Force. When the Soviets invaded, he returned to the armed forces as an officer. Nakagawa orchestrated mass evacuations from Hokkaido, saving tens of thousands from the oncoming Soviet advance. I met Generals Harper and Alexander early on. When the fighting started in earnest, my dad ordered the entire basement floor of the White House converted into a military command and control center. Both commanders came to visit him before they left for Japan. Alexis Alexander was some kind of logistics prodigy. She was only in Japan for a few months before she found herself taking command of all U.S. forces north of Sendai. The first and second battles of Akita ended with Alexander's forces scoring a near-total victory over the Soviets. At long last, our defeat at Kandahar was avenged. General Alexander became a national hero overnight in America. Pictures of her face were everywhere. News agencies were desperate for any new information about this woman who was simultaneously a tactical genius and attractive enough to cause army recruiters to be overwhelmed by eager young men. Once again, my dad struck when the iron was hot. In the spring of 2008, he filed the paperwork to run for a second term as U.S. president. Vice President Barack Obama had barely settled into his new job when my dad told him that he was picking another running mate. General Alexis Alexander would be the vice presidential candidate on my dad's ticket. Vice President Obama was not to be underestimated, though. He entered into the presidential race as well, formally challenging his boss for the top job. Republican leader John McCain also entered the contest. It was a tense election against the backdrop of a war that was rapidly escalating. Every single day, thousands of soldiers reported to their posts, keeping watch over America's stockpile of nuclear weapons. Only the president had the authority to use those weapons of mass destruction. And the American people clearly weren't comfortable choosing one of 3 men to hold the big red button in the middle of a fight. When it became clear that an electoral deadlock was imminent, my dad signed an executive order that elevated one of America's overseas territories to statehood. The people of Puerto Rico were shocked when they woke up one morning to discover that their island was now the 51st state in America. As I understand it, my dad did this to try and stop the Electoral College from deadlocking during the election. That plan worked, but just barely. In November of 2008, just as the death toll from the war in Japan crossed the 400,000 mark, the United States held another presidential election. I remember my sister and I watched the whole thing from one of our bedrooms, while our parents watched downstairs. 4 years ago, my dad won the presidency by a single vote. This time around, Vice President Obama received more votes from the American people than anyone else. But the Electoral College got to have the final say in the end, and they picked my dad by 2 votes. Winning a second term by razor-thin margins, my dad didn't take any time to celebrate. It was back to the Situation Room, back to the war. 2009. The 3rd year of the war was when things seemed to spiral out of control. In the Soviet Union, the unpopularity of the war had grown to such a level that people were taking to the streets in protest. Soviet President Kimoto knew she needed to give her people a better reason to fight, lest her own country come out from under her. She sent political operatives to occupy Japan, and they started to find communists who'd been living there. Within months, a new collaborationist government was established on Hokkaido Island. The so-called People's Republic proclaimed itself to be a new country under the control of the Japanese Communist Party. And President Kimoto declared to the world that she would send even more soldiers to Japan to defend freedom, justice, and communism. Well, the soldiers who defend freedom, justice, and democracy were now joining the battle in the tens of thousands. And not just in Japan. Despite Kimoto's best efforts, anti-government forces in Russia took full advantage of the fact that most of the Red Army was now in Japan. Rebel groups and insurrectionists began raising hell in the Caucasus regions, the Baltic states, and the Central Asian borderlands. Europe and Korea both smelled blood in the water. Throughout the year, the Soviet Union found itself under attack from several directions, including from within. After the end of World War III, many military scholars wondered why the conflict never escalated into a nuclear war, despite the fact that a grand total of 12 nuclear weapons were actually used in combat. Logically, a nuclear exchange should have occurred even after one blast, yet none ever did. It appears that in this one specific case, humanity owes its continued existence to the paradox. Government records made public after my dad left office show that throughout the entire war, my dad enforced a very strict no first-use policy regarding nuclear weapons. And many of the high-ranking members of the U.S. military supported this policy very strongly. Throughout the entire war, the United States only used a single nuclear weapon in combat during the final weeks of the war in 2012. As for the Russians, the behavior of the Soviet nuclear forces throughout the war are a very clear confirmation that this is where Akira Robinson went after the attempt on my father's life. A very large number of Red Army leadership actually wanted to use nuclear weapons against America and Japan immediately. President Kimoto dispatched agents to meet these commanders and either talk them down or somehow force them into compliance. Any one of those agents could have been the Paradox, and videos of Red Army leaders at the time suggest that at least 4 generals and 1 marshal were under the effects of mind control at various points during the war. There easily could have been more. Soviet President Kimoto herself also reportedly began displaying strange behaviors. Some videos of her from the time period show that the Soviet leader had cloudy, sunken eyes. In certain humanoid species, this physical change can be a side effect of being placed under mind control. However, this is not a universal occurrence, even among humans. Therefore, there is no way to know for certain if Kimoto was compromised by the Paradox. On this point, my friends and family are divided. Nobukazu Igarashi, my wife Chihiro, and my daughter Himawari are all of the opinion that Akira Robinson removed Kimoto from the equation and impersonated her for the remainder of World War III. I disagree, as does Varian and History Dude. We think the Paradox would strongly prefer to manipulate a ruler rather than be one. Actually supplanting a head of state would tie Akira to a specific region for a protracted period of time, which goes directly against the way she operates. Furthermore, Irisha Kimoto survived the Second Hyperspace War and lived for a further 10 years after the liberation of Earth. At no point during any of her testimonies to the GTRC did she ever report a lapse in memory long enough to suggest a body snatching. 2009 continued. Even if the Soviet nuclear forces were ordered to launch en masse, it may not have been possible. Rebel forces compromised the command and control systems of the SDF to the point where it was impossible to say with certainty who was in control of Russia's nuclear arsenal. To make matters worse, some member states of the Soviet Union began to eye other options, which drew the European Union and NATO into the fight. Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia took full advantage of the situation to break away from the USSR and reassert their independence. In the face of open hostilities, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization took no chances. American and European soldiers began flooding into the Baltic states, pushing Soviet forces out. The soldiers of the Western powers were welcomed as liberators, but they didn't stop. Instead, German, Polish, Swedish, and French soldiers turned south and headed for Kaliningrad, neutralizing Russia's last port on the Baltic Sea. Meanwhile, the situation in Japan had worsened. United Korea and China had each attempted to intervene in the war, only to find themselves in a standoff with each other. Over 1 million Chinese soldiers stood on the Yalu River, warning the Koreans not to help the Japanese. Meanwhile, Korean missiles and airplanes lashed out at Russian vessels in the Sea of Japan, cutting the Soviets off from the Pacific. The status quo wouldn't last. General Artyom Sidorov knew the military situation in Western Russia was perilous. He told me decades later that he came to a quick decision. The war in Japan needed to end as quickly as possible, and then he would take his massive armies back to the west and fend off the European armies. That was the plan, anyway. Sidorov's forces crossed the Tsungaru Strait at the Battle of Hakodate and launched a hasty, poorly planned invasion of Honshu, the largest of Japan's home islands. It was here that the future commander of XCOM, Laura Harper, cemented her legacy as a brilliant military leader. She blunted the Soviet attack and gave the enemy a very bloody nose. Her numerically inferior force kept the Soviets and their communist Japanese allies bottled up in Aomori for months before a supply chain problem forced her to withdraw. Meanwhile, the Japanese government finally realized the situation was getting dangerous. Soviet planes, subs, and warships plied Japan's coastline, endangering the lives of anyone who lived near the water. The imperial family was evacuated from Tokyo, moving west to Kyoto. The rest of the government made preparations to relocate to secure bunkers. The move happened just in time. As the Sendai campaign got underway, Soviet bombers struck the city, dropping high-explosive bombs on airport runways, helipads, highways, and ports. Tokyo's transportation hubs were crippled, and the enemy was approaching. 2010. The battle for Sendai lasted a full year, and the Soviets wrested the city away from our side one block at a time. That one fight by itself cost well over 1 million people their lives, many of whom were civilians. By this point, the so-called People's Republic had established itself as a belligerent military force and not much else. Nobody believed it was a real country, but its mere existence meant that there was now a sizable number of Japanese people fighting on the enemy side, waving communist flags. The fall of Sendai was a shot in the arm for the Soviets. Their newfound mission to create a communist puppet state in northern Japan suddenly looked achievable. At one point, my sister and I looked at the maps in the White House War Room and asked our dad, "Are we going to have to start saying our friends live in South Japan?" "I hope not," the president replied. Our dad's hair was gray, his face wrinkled. This war was taking a toll on him, too. Japan and her allies were hit with one disaster after another. The Soviets recovered the initiative and pushed back on all fronts. In Japan, the enemy advanced into Fukushima Prefecture, probing the mountain passes and looking for a way to threaten Tokyo itself. Meanwhile, the Soviet Navy finally gained access to the Pacific Ocean, owing to the People's Republic consolidating power in Hokkaido. Korea and China entered the war as well. The Koreans torpedoed one too many Soviet ships, and a punitive expedition of Chinese soldiers crossed the Yalu River, opening yet another front in the war. Meanwhile, Arisha Kimoto threw down the gauntlet in Europe. All this time, NATO forces were moving into Soviet territory along an axis running from Poland to Romania. The Soviet Union's final port cities in Europe were being threatened. As a mixed force of Romanian, Bulgarian, and Turkish soldiers closed in on Sevastopol, there were two flashes of light, each one brighter than the sun. Nearly 900,000 soldiers and civilians died in an instant. On March 8, 2010, the Soviet Union became the second nation in human history to use nuclear weapons in anger. France became the third mere hours later, when Sevastopol itself suddenly vanished off the face of the earth. Nuclear hellfire came in the form of 2 missiles fired from a French submarine. For about 3 days, everybody on Earth believed the apocalypse had come. A full-scale nuclear war looked imminent. My sister and I were rushed to a bunker deep underneath the White House, and we had to stay there for a week. When we finally came up, we learned just how close humanity came to wiping itself out. My dad had stayed awake for 5 days straight, working alongside the leaders of Europe to de-escalate the situation. Tragically, humanity's salvation came at a cost. NATO forces had disengaged and withdrew over 100 miles from the European front line. Huge tracts of territory we took from the enemy was abandoned, and our side withdrew their forces so far that parts of Poland and Romania were ceded to the enemy. Retreat in Europe was coupled with massive retaliatory attacks elsewhere. Because we weren't putting pressure on Western Russia anymore, this freed up Soviet troops to fight elsewhere. Russian rebels in Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia were put down with a vengeance, and the enemy made a new offensive in Japan, turning the Fukushima campaign into the next great battle of World War III. Overwhelmed, the Japanese government collapsed. After 4 days of frantic negotiations, the dominant political parties in Japan agreed to form a new government under the leadership of a man I met before the war began. The Emperor of Japan sent Ryo Nakagawa an invitation to form a new government less than a week after the old one fell apart. He threw himself into his work as soon as possible, trying to stop his battle-worn nation from bleeding to death. 2011. This whole time, Princess Asami and I stayed in close contact. We turned our bedrooms into mini war rooms. Her place in Kyoto had maps on every wall, and she and I would share news reports, moving around board game pieces on our maps to keep track of the war. I was 17 years old. She was 14. We were both terrified. My wife and I spent a long time talking about whether or not she should write this passage. I've told my side of the story multiple times now, in The Stormbreakers and The Siege of Hiroshima. I thought it was only fair to allow Chihiro to fully explain her side of the story. Here is her statement. I spent 4 years of my life running and hiding from the Russians. Every time we moved to another bunker or fled to some other city, the soldiers would say that keeping us safe was the most important thing. The way they talked, I got the feeling they believed Japan would just die if something happened to my uncle or any of his family. It didn't make sense to me. I watched the TV reports every day. I saw thousands of Japanese people, my people, being forced to live under Soviet occupation. And I said, what about them? Why can't we help them too? Millions of Japanese people were suffering and dying every day, and I felt horrible for just sitting in a bunker and watching it all happen. In March 2011, there was a natural disaster. An earthquake and tsunami devastated Fukushima Prefecture, which was the location of the front lines. Tens of thousands of soldiers on both sides were killed, and the fighting had to stop for a time while the ocean receded from the land. My uncle was moved to tears and encouraged everybody in the imperial family to do something to show their support for the people who were suffering. My older brother went above and beyond the call. He volunteered to join the JSDF, and my parents sent him off with so much support and happiness. I was happy he was going to fight. He was actually getting to do something instead of just waiting it out. On our last night before he left, my brother reminded me of that one American we met in Tokyo who talked about what it meant to be a hero. He said that this was his chance to do the same as Walsh, to step up and protect someone who couldn't protect themselves. I wanted to do that. I was growing to hate living in that bunker. Every day, people were fighting and dying, and every once in a while, some wounded soldier would be on the TV saying he would lay down his life for my uncle, the Emperor. I said, fine, you do that. I want to lay my life down for the people who live down the street, for the mothers and children on the TV who had to walk past Soviet soldiers just to go shopping in Sapporo each day. I hated being idle. I felt like I was being a waste, like I was a leech. I didn't want to be a leech. So, when my 15th birthday came around, I went to my parents and just told them flat out, I want to fight. And they said no. My father said that it was no place for women. I told him that the Americans and Russians were letting women fight, but he wouldn't hear it. I was so angry. I told him he was being stupid. He said I needed to learn my place. Of course, I was a teenager. I was the one being stupid, but I didn't know that then. Instead, I planned to do something stupid. For 2 months, I ate a lot of protein and started working out secretly in my room. Then, sometime in June, I could lift my own body weight and jog in place for half an hour. I thought I was ready. I snuck out of our safe house in Kyoto in the middle of the night. I was so upset with my parents that I didn't leave any kind of message for them. I just left. I dressed up like some high school delinquent and went straight to a JSDF recruiting station. I waited there until dawn. Of course, by that point in the war, they'd lost so many people that they were desperate for any kind of warm bodies. They never asked for my ID. The recruiter said he would fix everything as long as I gave him my name and ID details from memory. I gave him a made-up name, and he never checked to see if it was real. After that, I was no longer Princess Asami of Chiako. I was Chiho Tatsuya, apprentice seaman of the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force.